In the movie Aladdin, is this a familiar movie to most of you? Have heard it somehow, some way, right? There's a genie in a lamp who grants whoever rubs this lamp 3 wishes. Now, there are some rules for these wishes, right? You are not allowed to wish for more wishes. You cannot wish for somebody to love you or make you love someone else, and you cannot wish for somebody to come back from the dead. But every other wish is on the table. 3 wishes. Now, what would your 3 wishes be? Would you be like the, Miss Congeniality pageant person who says, world peace? Is that one of your wishes? Maybe you'd wish for a full retirement account, health and wellness for your family, a house on the waterfront. Would you wish for things in the present and future? Would you wish for a lot of things? Or would you wish for things to have gone differently in life? Maybe a relationship that ended poorly, a chronic or terminal health diagnosis that's impacted you or a loved one. Maybe you would wish that a certain stressor in your life had gone away or that an addiction wouldn't have ever begun. What would you wish for? Would you wish for things to be different, better? Would you wish for what you have right now and that would never change? Everything would stay as is. Would you simply wish for God's presence to be with you no matter what comes your way? What would you wish? Now, let's be clear, God is not a genie in a lamp, granting wishes left and right in our lives. God doesn't usually ask what we wish for specifically, but that's not really ever stopped us from treating our prayer time as, a wish list. And, well, to be honest, sometimes God does say yes to what we ask for, and sometimes God says no. God does want to know what is important to us and what is on our minds. God does enjoy honest conversation, especially in prayer. But prayer is not to be like kids making a wish list for Christmas, thinking about anything and everything they might dream of wanting, realizing that changes every 5 minutes. But God enjoys a conversation, a back and forth, listening and talking, bringing our questions and concerns, our fears and disappointments, our hopes and our dreams to God, while also hearing what God has for us, what God is asking of us, calling us to in this life. Now, there are many conversations in the Bible between God and humans, but one of the longest ones with a good bit of back and forth happens here in Exodus 3 and 4 with Moses at the burning bush. The Exodus story is one of the most foundational stories in all of the Old Testament and Scripture in general. The great salvation event of Israel's history where God shows up and delivers them from slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt and begins to move them toward the promised land. But how did we get to this place where Israel is enslaved? Well, if you don't quite remember or need a quick tour through Genesis, it's your lucky day. And by quick, I really mean a quick tour through Genesis, right? After Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, humanity spirals out of control all the way through Noah and the ark to the building of the Tower of Babel and the scattering of people and the confusion of languages by Genesis 11. And from that mishmash, God calls Abram and Sarai to be his chosen covenant family, from whom God will bless all the nations. And this covenant runs from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and from Jacob to his 12 sons. And after Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, is betrayed by his 11 brothers, he ends up in Egypt and becomes the second most powerful person next to Pharaoh. Now, Joseph at the end of Genesis recounts that what others meant for harm, God clearly intended for good, to preserve life and make the people of Israel numerous. In fact, they became so numerous that they became a threat. And a new Pharaoh rises to power who doesn't remember all the good that Joseph did. And he enslaves the people of Israel for his building projects. But the more Israel is oppressed, the more they multiply, until Pharaoh puts an order out there that whenever an Israelite boy is born, he is to be thrown into the Nile River. It's with these policies of death and slavery in place that Moses' story begins. Moses is born and kept hidden for a few months before he is placed in a basket among the reeds of the Nile, where he's discovered by none other than the daughter of Pharaoh herself. And so Moses, an Israelite boy, is adopted right into the family of Pharaoh in the courts of power. And Moses remains there for 40 years. He is a prince of Egypt, a man of two worlds. He is both a Hebrew and an Egyptian, and at the same time, he is neither, for he doesn't fit in with either people. Moses executes judgment on behalf of an Israelite who is being beaten by an Egyptian, and he kills him. And he thinks no one knows, but someone knows, right? And word gets out to Pharaoh. And so Moses flees for his life to the land of Midian, where he spends the next 4 decades sequestered away. Whatever plans Moses had for his life in the courts of Egypt are gone, withering in the desert land as he wanders watching over sheep. As Moses finds himself put out to pasture, toiling away in obscurity, the people of God find themselves groaning under their slavery and the yoke of oppression. Years pass, slavery endures, and the cries of the people rise up to God. God hears. God remembers his covenant, and God takes notice. For 40 years, Moses' life is the same. Day in and day out, shepherding the sheep with his staff in his hand, gathering the scattered, securing the flock, moving from grazing land to grazing land, and then back again. 40 years of sheep bleating or surrounded by silence and solitude, watching the stars every night that remind him of God's promise to Abraham. 40 years, Moses' life is mundane and ordinary, out of the public eye. When behold, right, God steps in and changes his life forever. It was an ordinary day when we meet Moses in Exodus 3. A day like any other day with his shepherd staff and sheep, but this day Moses encounters the divine, a strange sight. A bush is burning but not consumed, and Moses turns aside to look, and God calls out to him. The ground is holy, and so shoes are removed, and a declaration is made. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And so Moses hides his face, afraid to look. But God has been looking. God has been noticing. God has seen the misery of the people of Israel in Egypt. God has heard their cry, and God knows their suffering and is so moved that he comes down to deliver them, to bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. It is good news, Moses. I have come down to save my people, so I am sending you. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses in this moment is called. Moses is commissioned. And as God talks, Moses balks. Right, over the course of the conversation, Moses raises 5 questions or objections to what God is calling him to. And in each case, God responds. Now, before we get into these, let's just acknowledge, right, the fact of who we're dealing with. Moses is the person in the entire Old Testament. He is a prophet and leader who is unlike any other. Throughout Scripture, everybody is waiting for somebody like Moses to show up until Jesus comes onto the scene. Moses is incomparable. He is the greatest human figure in the Old Testament, and the best part, as Mark already showed us, he is incredibly human. He has questions. He has doubts, uncertainties. He doesn't feel up to the task that God is calling him to, and he would seemingly rather shirk all responsibility and let someone else do it so he can go gently into the night with his shepherd staff as a walking stick. Moses in Exodus 3 and 4 sounds an awful lot like you and like me. And that, my friends, is good news for us, right? For if God can use someone like Moses, fears, doubts, disappointments, and all, God can use you, and God can use me. Moses does have a lot going for him, but perhaps his greatest contribution to the cause and faith journey in our lives are his faults and failures that make him oh so human like the rest of us. He is not some untouchable figure. He is relatable. Now, at first, Moses' questions are very appropriate, right? Who am I that you're calling me, and who are you? Who am I in this grand scheme of things that you would send me, and who exactly are you to the people you're sending me to? How will they know that I have talked to you, God? And God's responses are so great here, right? It doesn't matter who you are, Moses, for I will be with you. That's what matters. And Moses might be thinking, oh, okay, well, that's not really all that helpful. And by the way, God says, my name is I am who I am, or I will be what I will be. Just tell them that the I am has sent you, and they'll listen to your voice. Now, at this point, Moses really hasn't had any solid answers in the midst of his doubts, other than to remember the fact that he is talking to God via a burning bush, and that should maybe quell some doubts. But not everyone else will have this burning bush experience. And so Moses begins to either project his own doubts onto the Israelites, or he begins to what if the situation to death. Right? What if they don't believe me? What if they don't believe you? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if, God? What if it all goes terribly wrong? Many of us struggle with what I'll call what if syndrome, right? Our minds begin to spiral out of control. We can spin any potential situation into a negative, paralyzing ourselves in place, removing our ability to trust. Our imaginations get the best of us, and we quickly find ourselves despairing and despondent. Even if we know the promise of God that I will be with you. Instead of focusing on what is certain and trustworthy, we get caught up in the what ifs. The beauty of this part of the story is that even as Moses just what ifs all over God, God's sovereignty allows for human free will and response. God may be adamant that the people will listen to Moses' voice, but that doesn't stop God from working with Moses through some of his what ifs. Or, well, let's suppose that this happens, or let's suppose they don't. God is big enough to handle our worries and concerns. We can name those fears about what if to God and let God comfort us with his presence and step us through some of the way things could play out. God is with us through all of our doubts and fears, and that is good news too. And so as Moses, what ifs God looks at Moses and simply asks, right, the questioning God, what is in your hand? Now, part of this is to ground Moses back into reality, to remind him of something that is certain and tangible and real. Moses realizes he's still holding his shepherd's staff. And with that, God begins to provide multiple signs for any potential Israelite unbelief or Moses unbelief. Moses' staff transforms into a snake and back again. His hand becomes diseased and healed again. Signs that Moses in the moment can experience and then can do for the Israelites, God tells him. And then God gives Moses one more future sign that, well, Moses is just going to have to trust that it will happen. For when he takes water from the Nile, God tells him it will become blood on the ground. Now, even armed with these signs, with the staff in his hand, Moses now turns to his fourth objection, that he's just not a good speaker, as he elaborates so eloquently. Like, he goes on and on in this verse about how he's not good at speaking. And God responds, well, hey, I know that, right? I know who you are, Moses, for I made you. and I'm still calling you. For I will be with you, and I will be with your mouth specifically to help you speak and to teach you what to say. But this is still not enough for Moses, right? Even after all of this, Moses is uncertain and doubting, so incredibly human, like you and I. Even through this entire conversation with signs and wonders, Moses still says, "Please, Lord, send somebody else." Now, although this is the most prominent translation, scholars have pointed out that there is some ambiguity in the Hebrew here that could make Moses' response more something like this: "Fine, whatever. I guess I'll go if that's what you want. I mean, God, if you think you still need to send somebody and that's me, then fine, I'll go." Right? It's like an 80-year-old with a bit of an attitude problem. Finally, after this whole conversation, finally do we now arrive at God's anger burning at Moses. God is certainly slow to anger through all of these questions and doubts. Right? God reveals later on, and after the golden calf incident, that the core of who he is slow to anger and abounding in love. And Moses experiences it here in Exodus 3 and 4 firsthand. And even in God's anger, there is still provision and promise and grace given to Moses that his brother Aaron, who has already been sent to find his long-lost brother, will join in this quest. And the passage ends with Moses being commanded to take this staff in his hand. And by verse 20, if we were to read just a little bit longer, the staff is no longer just Moses' shepherd's staff, but through the power of God's grace and transformation, it is, in verse 20, referenced as God's staff, with which Moses will do incredible things as he partners with the power of God, as he lives into the call that God has placed on his life. Right? With this staff, right? Here's what happens. With this staff in his hand, Moses will strike the Nile and it will turn the blood on the sand. With the staff in his hand, Moses will call forth thunder and hail and bring locusts upon the land. With this staff in his hand, Moses will split the Red Sea and the Israelites will cross into freedom on dry land. With this staff in his hand, Moses will strike the rock in the desert, and water will come at God's command. With his staff in his hand and the support of others, Moses will raise his hand and Amalek will fall as the Israelites take their stand. With his staff in his hand, Moses will strike another rock twice instead of speaking to it. And although water flows again, Moses will not enter the promised land. With his staff in his hand, Moses will lead the people to the doorstep of the Holy Land. God asks, "What is in your hand, Moses?" "A shepherd's staff," he says. But the staff becomes God's staff. God transforms more than just staffs. God transforms lives. Lives that are molded and shaped and formed into the calling that God has placed on us. So what's in your hand is the question that God asks us. What's in our hands as a church? How are we responding to God's call with what is in our hands? With our objections, our questions, our doubts and concerns and all, right? For 40 years, Moses carries a staff, a shepherd's staff. For 40 years, Moses lived in obscurity tending sheep. For 40 years, Moses has had time to grow bitter and angry that life has not gone the way he planned. For 40 years, Moses has also had time to reflect and grow. For 40 years, Moses carries the staff in his hand for God to transform it in a moment in his old age. When God asked the question of Moses, "What is in your hand?" At this point in the story, the staff is simply a staff, right? It's not a symbol of Moses' gifts and talents, of everything he's good at. No, the staff is actually a symbol of Moses' grief, of his disappointments, of his shame and discontentment, of the hopes and dreams that have shattered on the rocks or have collected dust in the desert. So many things have gone wrong in Moses' life, and it is all symbolized by the staff in his hand. What is in your hand? What cross do you bear? Where has life not gone as planned? What might you wish had gone differently? This is what is in your hand that God is calling you to use. That God will transform to display his power, his glory, and his grace in your life and in the world. What is in your hand? What is in our hands? What grief do you bear? Is it the death of a loved one? Is it a career that never panned out? A medical diagnosis or chronic illness or pain? What dreams have come crashing down? What plans were shattered and never fulfilled the way you hoped? What discontentment do you still hold, wishing that something were better or different? What disappointments do you carry? What shame do you bear? What addictions do you struggle with? What is too full in your life right now, too much and spilling over? What is too empty in your life right now and running dry? Right? Your answer to these questions, to these disappointments, this is the answer to what is in your hand. What honest conversation is God calling you to have with him about what is in your hand right now? For God is a God of transformation and grace. There is no pain in our lives that cannot be redeemed or used for good. The good news is that Jesus calls us to pick up our cross and follow him daily. The good news is that Jesus calls us to follow him with who we are, where we are, with what we have in our hands now. The good news is that Jesus calls us when we are weary and burdened to come to find rest in him, to take his yoke upon us and to learn from him where we will find rest for our souls. Right? Jesus doesn't call us to follow him once we've arrived, once we have everything planned out all perfectly and it goes the way we want it to. Jesus calls us in the midst of our fears and failures. He calls us in the midst of our brokenness and pain, our weariness and burdens, our questions and our doubts. God calls to us in our ordinary lives, things we maybe have done day in and day out for 40 years or more. God calls us where we are all too human like Moses to join him in his kingdom work. God calls us with our objections and our shortcomings. God calls us to transform us to be in relationship with him and to trust him in this journey of life. Right? As Paul reports his conversation with God when he heard, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul then says, "I will therefore boast all the more about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may reside in me. I take pleasure," he says, "in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." God's grace is more than sufficient for your life, for what is in your hand, and for what God calls you to. May we have the courage, like Moses, to have the conversation with God, to learn to trust more and more each day as we partner with God in this world and in our lives. Amen.